Hi. I'll just introduce my role. So I'm the specialist family violence practice lead here at Barwon. It is a 2-year funded pilot project initiative from FSV. We're currently in our second year of the project. My role has multiple facets to it. Two of the main parts of my role is to increase people's awareness in the family violence sector of disability, how it can present different ways in which family violence is specific for people with disabilities, which we'll cover later in this, or some of, and how do we increase access and open up pathways for people with disabilities to access the supports that they need. And part of the second part of my role is to provide secondary consultation to practitioners in the family violence space in Barwon around their work with people with disabilities. What other ways could we engage them if they have an intellectual disability? What suite of easy read documents, or if they need easy read documents, do we have to support a richer and deeper conversation with that client? And how do we then move that education from into that care team, and how do we work with NDIS practitioners, as an example, to understand family violence and how it presents. So for this presentation and for the work I do, the definition of disability that we're working with includes people with physical, psychosocial, cognitive, communication and sensory difficulties, and chronic health issues. The disability can be apparent or not apparent to the naked eye, and the disability can be temporary, episodic, or permanent. So family violence is deeply gendered. Overwhelmingly, the majority of perpetrators are men, and victim survivors are women and children. It is acknowledged that broader conceptions of gender apply to individuals' identities, experience, and manifestations of family violence. This presentation does use gendered language to describe family violence, and to explain the language used is in line with the Commission and the Family Violence Information Sharing Scheme guidelines. So you may hear the terms AFM, affected family member, victim survivor, and PUV, so person using violence, or perpetrator, in recognition that these terms are widely used in the community. So just wanted to touch base on some statistics that support an increase in understanding of the prevalence of family violence for people with disabilities. So the information comes from Changing the Landscape, and there's also been a recent document released from Women with Disabilities, which I'm happy to send through, which also has some understanding of the effects on our people with disabilities. So Australian and international research has found that violence against women and girls with disabilities tends to occur more frequently, over a longer period of time, across a wider range of settings, and to be perpetrated by a greater range of people than violence against women and girls without disabilities. Male intimate partner violence is a leading contributor to disability and illness in women. As an example, when we think about acquired brain injuries or traumatic brain injuries, lifelong chronic health concerns that are a direct result of experiencing family violence. Women with disabilities are 2 times more likely than women without disabilities to experience sexual violence. Evidence indicates that between 25 and 33% of women with disabilities have experienced sexual violence, compared to an estimated 15 to 16% of women without disabilities. And 65% of women with disabilities experience intimate partner family violence since the age of 15, compared to 16% of women without disabilities. And I just wanted to note that this is based on evidence and statistics that we have gathered. We also understand that it is significantly underreported for people with disabilities who have experienced family violence. So I just wanted to note that and so one of the is understanding that people have a disability and allowing them to identify that they have a disability. So some of the barriers in understanding this is that some people who have a disability do not have an official diagnosis. They do not want a diagnosis or identify with their diagnoses, or potentially misdiagnosed for various reasons. They may not identify as having a disability, even if they have NDIS, Centrelink, they've got support coordination, they've got care teams and therapists. They still may not identify. I especially understand in my work with youth in that 16 to 19-year-old time age gap. A lot of the work was helping them to understand their potential disability and how it impacted on them. And some may not want to disclose a disability due to fear of judgment, discrimination, because they're tired of educating others, because they've had negative experiences, and most importantly, they may not trust us yet. So some of the barriers for people with disabilities to access services is attitudinal, that word, sorry, or cultural barriers, fear of not being believed or understood, inaccessible information on recognizing, defining and understanding family violence. As an example, easy English, inaccessible information on support for family violence, example, what services are available, how to access them, how to identify family violence as family violence in itself. So what happens, who can help, systemic issues with accessing correct levels of support, difficulty accessing or transporting aids. And some of the work I do with practitioners is how do we support them so in their safety plan they have access to their the supports that help them with the day-to-day life. And a quick example of that is I worked with a practitioner who was helping a lady who was in her mid-60s and she was using a walker. And so part of the safety plan was that a second walker was purchased and kept at a family's home or a friend's home, so that if she did have to leave her situation quickly, that the walker was already there and present and she didn't have to worry about trying to carry it with her, or and she knew that it was there and it was ready and available for her. Another barrier is inaccessible service accommodation options and or lack of accommodation results in a reluctance to leave a modified home, or a person having increased vulnerabilities. And when I say that, one of the things that comes to mind is, people with disabilities, we fight really hard. They fight really hard to have a home that's modified to best suit their needs. And, there potentially is a question there. Is it safe? Do they stay because of their home is modified? And how do we as a service, how do we as a sector support people with disabilities to have opportunities to leave? So there's been a few cases that I've walked alongside where we've been talking about, like, how can we build, or in the background, their NDIS support. So let's talk about SIL, let's talk about SDA, let's get that in the back of the plan. So if they are in a position where they're ready to leave the family violence situation, they're able to stay in their home, and we bring in a model of support that supports them to maintain their living in that family home. And in one of the cases where that has been actually quite successful, and a lady who experienced family violence for 20 years is free from that. She has a full exclusionary IVO and a 24/7 model of support that come in and help her to live in her own home and maintain her relationship with her children. So that took 2 years to achieve, but for her, that's a lifelong sustainable outcome. So a couple other barriers, reliance on the person using violence for care and a fear of who can provide that support if that person isn't there. Stakeholder processes not being family violence informed. So we're part of my community of practice. We're currently working with NDIA in relation to a couple of the systemic barriers. One of them was that if a NDIA plan nominee needed to be removed or changed because that person was a perpetrator, the original format had that NDIA would reach out to the person using violence in writing and confirm that they were going to happy to be removed as the plan nominee, whereas the most recent update, and we're still waiting on it to be released in formal communication, is that that's no longer required and they will not be reaching out to the person using violence to confirm that they no longer wish to be the plan nominee. We're just working through some of the additional barriers to that now within NDIS, but to know that there's some sector movement in that is really, really positive. I'm going to talk about ableism just for a quick moment. So ableism is the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities. It is a favouring of able neurotypical people and the exclusion and devaluation of people who are disabled and neurodivergent. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines people by the disability. Like racism and sexism, ableism classifies entire groups of people as less than and includes harmful stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations of people with disabilities. Ableism manifests in many ways. There are particular expressions of ableism that play a role in driving violence against women and girls with disabilities. These ableist drivers of violence occur at multiple levels of society and interact with and reinforce each other. Ableism interacts with other forms of discrimination such as gender inequality, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and ageism. This creates multiple and intersecting forms of systemic discrimination for Aboriginal people, LGBTIQ plus people, multicultural people, old people, and young people. And I just have a quote that for me kind of really brings it all together. Think of all the buildings, spaces, places, events, and so on that were often designed without consideration of the needs of people with disability. Often we are the afterthought or not thought of at all. So I just have 2 or 3 more slides that just talk to some of the ways in which family violence presents with people with disabilities. And some of the conversations I'm having with staff and practitioners here at SAVS, at Orange Door, at Mallee, at local family violence services, to just increase in understanding that for people with disabilities, it presents in different ways, and we need to think outside the box, and we need to take away, solidify the education that we've had around family violence, and then move it outside of that so that we can start seeing that it affects people with disabilities in different ways. So I'll just cover a couple. In relation to psychological and emotional abuse, humiliating the individual, example, moving the furniture so the person who was blind bangs into it, threatening violence, institutionalization, withdrawal of care. As an example, you need me here. If you're not here, then you're going to go and you're going to move into aged care. You're going to move into a home with other people with disabilities. You're not going to be able to live here on your own. You're not going to be able to parent because you have a disability. You need me and you need to rely on me in that space. Restricting services, restricting service access. So withholding treatment, NDIS services, the person with disability is establishing and developing really significant rapport and is moving into a really therapeutic space with their, say, psychologist or support coordinator, and is starting to really embed their goals. And then the person using violence just cancels everything, uplifts and changes all of their supports. And in my time here, I've seen that occur multiple times. And the person with a disability, even though they're verbal, doesn't have a voice in that space. I've seen where they've been withholding disability-related equipment, withholding home mods, withholding purchasing of specific equipment to help the person with their everyday life, misusing medication, throwing away medication, preventing or restricting access in the community, or personal possessions. I've worked a couple of cases where there's been forced isolation. So they've locked a door and the person with disability doesn't have the dexterity or is unable to unlock the door themselves. Or they've put the brakes on the person's wheelchair, and again, the person doesn't have the capacity or dexterity to lift the brakes and release them themselves. So, in fact, are stuck in the position of, where the brakes have been put on. And in some of the cases I've worked, they've been left there for a significant period of time without food, water. And we've had a recent case where a tracking device was put on a person's wheelchair, so the person using violence knew where that person was the whole time. And then just wanted to explore this a little bit. So more and more, we're seeing referrals come through to Orange Door, and especially through L17s, which is their referral pathway into Orange Door, where the person using violence is the carer, and the person who's the affected family member is misrepresented on the referral that they're the perpetrator of family violence, and the carer presents as being very victorious or has care stress, and that's what's caused the police to attend, as opposed to the actual situation where they are perpetrating against the person who has a disability. And in some of those cases, the person with a disability isn't even spoken to by the police. So in Barwon at the moment, there's a project that looks at those referrals and has really good communication back to the police around the misidentification in L17s. And there's some movement, and I think Ballarat is a trial site for having an actual worker on the ground that the police consult with before an L17 is finalised, where they talk through this misrepresentation. Oh yeah, and then that's me.